a dialysis clinic plagued by a string of mysterious deaths.
They both went into cardiac arrest within 30 minutes of each other.
Employees at the facility were on edge, and patients were acutely aware that something was amiss, something was wrong.
Even under the changes in policy and procedure, the deaths still continued.
An investigation reveals evidence of an intentional crime.
There was a horrible smell that burned my eyes and my nostrils like bleach.
The police department took thousands of syringes.
The first thing we did was we identified that, yes, bleach was present in those syringes.
What it probably felt like to my mom was being burned from the inside out.
And when the killer is unmasked, it sends shockwaves through this small Texas town.
What was going on there? What was happening to these patients?
Why in the little Lufkin would there be a serial killer?
I don't know what's going on here, and it's just scary.
How could another human being do that to anybody?
For millions of Americans, dialysis treatments are a crucial part of their survival.
My mother had issues off and on the whole time we were growing up with diabetes, blood pressure, that type of things, which led to her having to go to dialysis. When she go to the doctor, I always went with her. I always had that drawn to take care of another human being, and I've been a nurse for over 33 years. Dialysis treatment is that when you have some kidney malfunction or your kidneys aren't functioning as well as they should, and they actually pull your blood out and they clean it and then they put it back in. And it's a 3 to 4 hour process.
For 68-year-old Fran Metcalf, trips to the DaVita Clinic in Lufkin, Texas have become a regular part of her life.
The DaVita Dialysis Center in Lufkin is one of 2 large dialysis centers that take care of patients who've got kidney failure.
We were taking her to dialysis 3 days a week. I could go up and visit with her on Saturdays when I was off.
When Fran would come to dialysis, some real bonds were being made there, and she would tell us about the friendships that she had. I think it was a real personal experience because all of the people there receiving dialysis were really struggling to, maintain a good quality of life with all the obstacles that were in their way.
To both patients and staff, it's a routine process with relatively few complications. However, on April 1st, 2008, that isn't the case.
Fran was having a fairly normal treatment day that day, blood pressure normal, etc. And then all of a sudden she bottomed out.
Her blood pressure dropped drastically, and the alarms and the alerts were going off.
They call an ambulance. Luckily in Lufkin, it's small enough that the ambulance is less than 2 minutes away. Then they move to the hospital.
My dad had the nurse call me from the hospital. They just told me that she'd had cardiac arrest and there was some issues and I need to get there fast. When I get there, she had already passed. From my understanding, it is very rare for someone on dialysis to go into cardiac arrest. It was a big shock. I just really want to know why this happened.
Fran Metcalf was born on August 3, 1939 in Arkansas, and very quickly she faced serious health issues.
My mother had polio at a very young age, so she struggled with mobility and had to have braces on her legs.
As she got older and, her disability was affecting her a lot in school. Her education was not, great. She spent a lot of time in the hospital.
But there was a silver lining to Fran's illness. As a young woman, her treatments caused her to cross paths with her future husband.
Fran's aunt lived in Port Arthur, Texas, so her mom would bring her down to Port Arthur. There were bigger hospitals on the Gulf Coast.
She met my dad that was in the Coast Guard. They just hit it off. He was good looking, and Mother fell head over heels in love. Mom and Dad had dated probably about 6 months before they got married because he was headed back out and he wanted her to go with him. So it was a short engagement. She was there for my graduation. She was there, to bring me a cup of coffee at night when I was studying, just to make sure that I had everything that I needed.
As Fran entered middle age, she delighted in becoming a grandmother to 8 grandchildren.
She was wonderful at, planning parties and wanting to be at every event that the kids had. My youngest daughter's basketball games, the boys played baseball.
She was a very loving person. She just loved to be surrounded by people, listen to stories.
Unfortunately, Fran's health struggles continued. She was diagnosed with diabetes, and when her kidneys worsened, she was prescribed dialysis treatments. Fran became a regular patient at the Lufkin Clinic, where she found another kind of family.
She started dialysis in 2007. She made many friends. You're sitting beside someone for 3 to 4 hours. Even the nursing staff, the whole thing, it becomes a family.
But after a routine treatment, an unexplained heart attack has claimed Fran's life, and her loved ones are struggling to understand how it could have happened.
You don't expect typically for a dialysis patient to have a heart attack or get worse during dialysis, because the point of the dialysis is to be taking impurities out of the patient's blood.
I think that one of the hardest things for me was not to be able to have a goodbye moment with my mom. And so I reached down and I kissed her on the cheek. When I did, there was a horrible smell that burned my eyes and my nostrils. She smelled like bleach.
Fran's family has no way of knowing if the smell had anything to do with her death, but they are determined to find out what went wrong. Unfortunately, Fran wasn't the only death at the clinic that day.
Claire Strange was a grandmother. She was born during the Great Depression, and she worked on the family farm. She went to church. She was part of a tight-knit community, and she'd been on dialysis for about 8 to 9 years prior to her death.
At the time of April 1st, when she went to visit the dialysis facility, she was screened as normal, and again, an uneventful dialysis process would have been expected. She went into cardiac arrest and also died.
It's like, oh, Mother wasn't the only one. Claire Strange was a name that Mom had mentioned. That was a lady that was real sweet to her.
They both went into cardiac arrest within 30 minutes of each other.
To have 2 patients die on the same day is just, the odds of that are astronomically low.
Our minds are really beginning to start to inquire what was going on there, what was happening to these patients.
Coming up, the inexplicable deaths continue.
She had no immediate health problems, and she died almost immediately.
And patients witness a chilling scene.
Someone walked over to a bleach solution bucket on the floor and draw out that solution into a syringe.
After the unexplained deaths of Fran Metcalf and Clara Strange, family members are pressuring the DeVita Clinic for answers.
It was treated as a medical anomaly. Statistics are accurate to a point, but there's always the outliers.
DeVita was very concerned, and they began a very introspective process of trying to understand what was going on.
They initiated a procedure where they began saving items from cardiac incidents and reviewing the medical charts and seeing if there was any medical explanation for what caused those deaths.
During the following week, 5 more patients suffer cardiac arrests. Thankfully, they survive, but administrators are alarmed to say the least.
DaVita sent high-level nurses to the facility to try observing if there was some breakdown in procedure or some kind of process that wasn't being done right. And they weren't able to find anything that could explain these untoward results.
After analyzing their procedures, the clinic could not identify an obvious cause for these cardiac events.
There's no indication to that point that there's any nefarious activity going on. These are health-compromised individuals to begin with, otherwise they wouldn't be on dialysis.
The clinic staff stays alert while they remain open to continue serving the community of Lufkin. But 15 days later, 2 more patients suffer cardiac arrests. One of them is 58-year-old Garland Kelly Jr.
My dad, Garland Kelly Jr., grew up in Lufkin, Texas, and he was on the championship team with the Dunbar High School football team.
Garland's wife, La Francis, was his high school sweetheart. Together, they built a home and raised 3 daughters.
He was an insurance salesman, so that was his primary occupation, and then he always officiated football games on the side, so that was like his little side hustle thing. He didn't meet a stranger, ever. Would talk to anybody and would just embrace everybody. It was probably when I was in high school, which would be like in the 80s, when he learned that he had diabetes. You know, obviously he wasn't happy about having to go on dialysis, but if that's what it took for him to live, then he, you know, had to do it. He loved my mom. Their 40th anniversary would have been in March.
Now, just a month after his anniversary celebration, Garland has become the latest DaVita patient to suffer a cardiac arrest.
They obviously began resuscitation attempts. They were successful. His heart began to beat on his own, and he was transported to the hospital. He was placed on a ventilator.
We all got to the hospital around the same time, and it was just family there waiting to see what the outcome was. He was in a coma.
Unlike the other heart attacks, a clinic technician noticed something strange just before Garland coded.
She witnessed what she described, it looked like a black ball of hair that went through his line and into his system.
Whenever that clot appeared, he went into cardiac arrest. It was an anomaly for treatment. You often see clots when people are being dialyzed. This one had a very unique appearance.
With 2 deaths on their hands, the dialysis clinic initiates a new safety precaution.
DaVita instituted a policy of not reusing dialyzers. However, even under the monitors and the changes in policy and procedure, the deaths still continued.
Employees at the facility were on edge, and I think patients were acutely aware that something was amiss, something was wrong, but they needed this treatment in order to survive. It was so inconvenient for them to travel out to Livingston or out to Henderson, about an hour-and-a-half drive from Lufkin, in order to receive these treatments 3 times a week.
6 days after Garland Kelly, 2 more patients suffer cardiac events, including 63-year-old Cora Bryant.
Cora Bryant was a mother of 5 children. She had 13 grandchildren, and she did not let the fact that she was on dialysis control her life.
What Miss Bryant experienced that day was way outside the norm. Before Miss Bryant coded, she asked the nurse, "What did you give me?" That was overheard by multiple people around her.
Of course, no one knew what she meant by that then.
Like Garland Kelly Jr., the heart attack has left her in a coma. Before the end of the week, it happens 6 more times, including to Opal Mae Few.
Opal Few was a lady that was 90 or 91 years old, and she was very active, no expectation of any immediate health problems. And Ms. Few died almost immediately there in the facility.
My mother, Opal Mayfew, was raised in Pollock, which is just about 8 or 10 miles outside of Lufkin. My mom always said is that when she had her children, there was never any other goal in life other than to provide for them and to raise them to be the best people that they could be.
Opal had kidney issues later in life, and like the first victim, Fran Metcalf, she enjoyed the community of patients at the clinic. Now, she appears to have suffered the same fate.
I got the phone call that you don't ever want to get. And I didn't believe it. I was like, no, not my mom. There's no way that she could have died. I was overwhelmed by grief. There had been no news, no articles of the other people who had passed away, so I was unaware. There's been several deaths when she was there.
DaVita began to look at everything, the patient's medical history, the employees working, the practices, the water filtration, the medicine. They looked at everything.
Clinic administrators are at a loss to explain what's happening, so they finally decide to call in experts.
Toward the end of April, the DaVita company contacted the Centers for Disease Control and says, hey, can you help us? Can you send somebody? We've got patients getting sick and we can't tell why. We've checked everything we know. Help us, please.
For several weeks, the DaVita Clinic in Lufkin, Texas has remained open as they internally investigate over 24 emergency calls and 3 mysterious deaths. As no progress has been made, a doctor from the Center for Disease Control arrives to review the cases. He can't find any contaminants or natural causes, which leads him to one inevitable conclusion.
Through analysis of the statistical likelihood was that one of the employees might be killing people.
In most cases of healthcare killers, there are multiple victims. The most common way, over 50% of patients are killed through some type of injectable.
CDC suggested serial killer, but there again, you always have to follow the evidence. At that point, you have somebody's observation. There was no playbook, as it were, on how to deal with this.
While the CDC suspects patients are being harmed intentionally, the clinic remains functioning with managers on high alert while they investigate further. Within days of the CDC doctor's assessment, 2 patients report suspicious activity.
On April the 28th, Lurleen Hamilton, Linda Hall were being dialyzed. They were already nervous, alert, and scared because of the number of deaths, so they were paying attention.
They started their treatment around 5:30 that morning, and Miss Hall noticed a nurse was acting fidgety, a bit out of sorts. That's what first drew her attention. She watched as the nurse walked over to a bleach solution bucket on the floor and crouched down and draw up that solution into a syringe. From there, she watched, incredibly, as that nurse walked over to another patient who was sleeping and then inject that solution into the lines.
The nurse moved sneakily. She was trying to hide the fact that she had done it. They didn't feel comfortable making an outcry because they were still hooked to machines, which that nurse had the responsibility of hooking, unhooking them from.
Ms. Hamilton got the patient care tech that she trusted and told her what she'd seen.
They were able to identify Kim Saenz as being the person that injected the bleach.
The The patient is immediately rushed to the hospital for treatment as the clinic's administrators approach Kimberly Clark Saenz, a licensed vocational nurse on staff.
And they said, why don't you go home, take the rest of the day off? We've got a matter we need to look into, and so they sent Kimberly home.
The administrators there secured where Miss Holland Hamilton said that they had seen Kim, the nurse, place the syringes after she was finished with them. They did their own investigation of those 2 sharps containers. They opened them up. They found syringes which were not marked, empty 10 ml syringes without needles.
DaVita administrators immediately close the clinic until the investigation is concluded and patient safety can be guaranteed.
By this time, it was about 4:30 in the afternoon, and they called the Lufkin Police Department and said, we think we need to have the police come and let us turn this over to you.
The main thing we could do that night was seize everything that we could think of, take it back to the station, and then contact those who were much more knowledgeable than us about how to handle it. The decision we made that night was to take everything we could, because that medical waste contained in those 36 sharps containers was approximately 3 weeks worth of waste and covered the time period from April the 1st all the way up to April 28th.
With the evidence secured, Lufkin police look into Kimberly Saenz.
Kim was born locally. She had lived here all of her life. She didn't graduate from high school. She had become pregnant during her time in high school and left school because of that. For a while, she was a happy homemaker. There was some ultimately problems with her first marriage.
After divorcing her first husband in 1997, Kim remarried in 2000 and had another child.
She needed to find a career, and she went to school, and she became a nurse.
We learned that she was fired from Woodland Heights Hospital for suspicion of stealing patient medication. She had moved to a couple of different jobs, and then she landed at the DaVita dialysis facility. During the time that she went to work at the DaVita dialysis facility, she was under investigation by the Texas Board of Nurse Examiners for the alleged theft of patient medication.
In the medical profession, apparently, it's really easy to pass from job to job. You can leave employers off of your references and resumes. No documented background check is required.
There was a mixed bag in terms of opinions, even among her patients, on whether she really had done what she'd been accused of doing.
I found it hard to believe that one person could intentionally kill that many people for no apparent reason. Why in the little Lufkin would there be a serial killer?
Coming up, police come face to face with an angel of death.
If I'm doing something wrong, I want to know that I don't want to kill somebody.
And the truth behind the deaths comes to light.
She had typed in, can bleach be detected in a dialysis line?
After patients witness a nurse appearing to inject bleach into a dialysis patient's lines, initial tests confirm their statements.
There were thousands of syringes in the sharps containers, and the police department took each container, took each syringe out and labeled them and tested them with litmus paper, and it tested positive for a basic solution. So it supported the story of Ms. Hamilton that bleach had been in the syringe.
There was no reason for anyone to ever use a syringe to draw bleach in to measure it. That just doesn't make any sense to me.
2 days into their investigation of the deaths at the Lufkin Dialysis Clinic, Detectives interview the accused nurse, Kimberly Saenz.
We didn't lay our cards out on the table, what the witnesses had seen or anything like that right off the bat. We just wanted to hear her side of the events.
There's things that we want to sit down and discuss with you.
Hey, I've only been here 8 months. But I just wonder about the blood pressures, you know, when they come in and they're really high. I get so scared they're going to stroke out. And it's just scary. And then they said that we've had so many deaths in the past 7 months. I mean, I'm scared to leave my patients. You know, I'm just constantly, are you okay? Are you okay? Are you okay?
Before police bring up the accusations, Kim goes on the defense, clearly aware she had been reported by patients.
What hurts me the most is for 2 patients to accuse me of giving another patient medication that was not ordered.
Did you give her any medicine?
I did give her some saline, only because she said she was cramping.
She herself brought up the issue of bleach and sort of suggested ways that bleach could have gotten into the patients.
If our machines are hooked up and they have some bleach in them, I haven't researched into that, but I just have to wonder what kind of reactions would have happened, you know. I know we bleach them every week.
That brings up red flags in and of itself because we hadn't told her what the allegations were. And here she is already trying to prepare a ready-made explanation.
Police have been told bleach is used for sanitizing equipment exteriors, but not the way Kim describes.
1 part bleach to 10 parts water is used as a disinfectant.
You use a syringe to pull your 10 cc's of bleach up?
Sometimes I do when I can't find the little medicines cups. There wasn't any cups up there that day. But if you use a syringe, 10 cc's, then you're gonna have to, put it in the receptacle.
Investigators are skeptical.
I don't know what's going on here, and it's just scary. And if I'm doing something wrong, I want to know that I know something wrong because I don't want to kill somebody.
Kimberly's interview is concluded, and she is allowed to leave.
We knew that the facility was closed and she wasn't going to be working on any other patients. I mean, it's frustrating. You may have a good idea in your head what happened, but until you can prove it, you understand you have to let them go.
After the interview, police continue testing the medical equipment involved.
Syringes that showed indications of having bleach they sent to a lab. DeVita had 8 sets of lines that came from patients who were believed to be victims.
This occurred over the period of about 3 or 4 days. The first thing we did was we identified that yes, bleach was present in those sharps containers and in those syringes. Then we started trying to counteract that argument that she had used it for measuring. We actually subpoenaed all the purchase orders to prove that there was cups always available. We also interviewed each employee to see if they'd ever heard of that being a practice or seen that being a practice, and none of them had.
The following day, Kimberly's husband Kevin provides some unexpected help.
Her husband had filed for a divorce. He actually contacted the police department.
Kimberly Saenz had a lot of problems in her marriage and her personal life. Her husband, Kevin, he was fed up.
He advised that he had worked on a computer she was using, and during the process of that, he had found that she had a search history for using the word hemo. Hemodialysis is the full technical term for what was being done at DeVita. Based upon that information, we were able to get a search warrant to seize her computers.
They found searches on the computer about the effect of bleach on patients, and she had typed in a question on her computer: can bleach be detected in a dialysis line?
The terms bleach and bleach poisoning were done on April the 1st before she went to work. People died on that day.
As the testing and investigation continues over the next several months, the two surviving patients in comas sadly pass away. 63-year-old Cora Bryant and 58-year-old Garland Kelly Jr.
He was in the hospital from April to August. And we had scriptures all over the wall, and we just believed God that he would wake up, you know. And then he actually died August 16th of 2008.
There are now 5 deaths law enforcement believes are connected to Kimberly Saenz. But to charge her, police still need solid evidence.
We still need the scientific proof that A, bleach had been introduced into those patients, and B, the introduction of that bleach had caused their deaths. And at that time, it wasn't there or available to us. Here's somebody that I believed had committed multiple murders on multiple occasions, and she's walking the street, so holding her accountable was a priority.
Investigators in Lufkin, Texas find themselves with a unique challenge. How to prove the existence of a serial killer without a clear murder weapon.
The mechanism of injury was the introduction of bleach into dialysis lines, and there's very little research where bleach has been used to injure somebody.
The black clot seen by a technician going through Garland Kelly's line provides a possible clue.
We suspected that bleach might change the color of blood, so we actually did an experiment where we went to the hospital and had them withdraw some arterial blood, which is bright red, from Sergeant Abbott, and we dropped some bleach in it, and it immediately turned black. What we believe is that the patient care technician witnessed the result of Kimberly Saenz injecting bleach. Red blood cells, your little cells that flow in the veins and arteries. When they encounter bleach, they explode. If enough blood cells explode or burst, this releases potassium. Potassium gets to the heart, causes cardiac arrest.
What it probably felt like to my mom was being burned from the inside out. I can't imagine the pain that they went through.
How could another human being do that to anybody? And then to think that they not only did it to my mom, but they were doing it to multiple people, it was overwhelming.
But now detectives are faced with another problem.
It's one thing to say we think it's likely that the defendant in this case put bleach into the lines of her patients, but it's quite another then to be able to prove that that is what killed them, especially in patients who are already generally health compromised.
But there is no ordinary medical blood test to test for the presence of bleach.
We got a real break in the case when we found an expert who had been doing studies with rats involving chlorine gas. And chlorine is basically the same thing as bleach. This expert explained that if bleach had been introduced in significant amounts into the bloodstream of the patient, they should have an amino acid called chlorotyrosine that should be at a very high level within their system.
What he found is every blood sample from a suspected victim showed the presence of chlorotyrosine.
Police can now definitively say bleach was used to kill 5 patients and seriously injure several others. Now they just have to prove Kimberly Saenz was the one who did it.
They looked at the employment records, and the only employee that was present for every cardiac event was Kimberly Saenz. We presented it to the grand jury. We had 5 murder victims, and we had 5 people that we believe were injured by the injection of bleach that did not die but recovered. They returned an indictment for capital murder and then 5 counts of aggravated assault.
They agreed with us that there was enough probable cause to issue an arrest warrant for Kim, and she was ultimately arrested April the 9th of 2009.
She had a $500,000 bond. We heard word through the community that she was bonded out.
Kimberly Saenz was described as shy, kind, sweet. No one could believe that she was behind this.
The only restriction she had was not working in healthcare, and she was required to wear a GPS monitor.
It makes you angry to think about the person who took your mother's life, walking around free, able to wake up in the morning, able to do anything. It makes you angry.
Potentially responsible for the death of 5 seniors in the small town of Lufkin, Texas, Kimberly Saenz remains free for nearly 3 years while prosecutors prepare their case against her. She is ultimately charged with murder for the deaths of Fran Metcalf, Clara Strange, Garland Kelly, Cora Bryant, and Opal May Few. And she is charged with assault for 5 surviving victims.
The case was pretty complicated, and her defense lawyer wanted records of DeVita, and he wanted an opportunity for other experts to review the records.
In March 2012, the trial finally begins.
I was able to go to the trial, not every single day. It was too overwhelming to listen, to look at her.
Kimberly Saenz seemed very relaxed. She was cheerful, joking with her counsel. Just seemed like she did not understand that she was on trial for capital murder.
Kimberly's defense attorney uses the clinic's records to argue they are the real culprits.
He laid out a compelling argument that she was a scapegoat for this Fortune 500 company, and they were trying to pin it on one person in order to shift the blame.
One of his defensive theories was there was a chlorine leak, that somehow tap water was getting through into the system. Now, if there had been a tap water leak, everybody would have gotten sick because every patient got the same water, but only certain patients got sick and certain patients died.
The problem for the defense in that regard was we had repeated test results for the water showing that there was no bleach in it.
The trial lasted 4 weeks, and the jury deliberated part of one afternoon and into the next day, so it was quite a quick deliberation for the amount of evidence they had to go through.
On March 30th, 2012, the jury renders its verdict.
Kim Saenz was convicted of capital murder and aggravated assault, 3 counts of aggravated assault, and acquitted on 2. She was sentenced to 1 term of life without parole and 3 counts of 20 years each for the assaults.
When the verdict was read, and then when sentence was passed, there was a sense of relief that she can't do it to anyone else.
The only real question is why, and everybody wants to know that. The only one that knows it is her, and until she explains it, nobody will know. It seemed like she was killing just indiscriminately for no reason. My personal theory, she couldn't control what was going on in her life, and I believe she took her frustrations out on those patients.
Her marriage was falling apart, and this was her way of asserting control and power in what was a very chaotic personal life.
All the other demons that she had in her life, I believe that's what caused her to snap.
Carlin Kelly Jr., the myth, the man, the legend. He was a man covered in the grace of God, had so much love.
My mom was a God-loving person, and she speaks to me a lot of times of just saying, "Want to just let it go, forgive." And I know that she would have forgiven her, and I'm trying.
Cora Bryant died just a few weeks shy of her 65th birthday, and her family and her loved ones remember her as someone who had just a great sense of humor and laughter about her, and she loved her children and her grandchildren very much.
There's no way to really describe in words what my mom meant to us as a family. She was the glue that held us together. The loss that we endured, I can't convey in real words.
Part 1, The Hook. The night Canada could not forget. On a cold November night in 1997, in the quiet streets of Saenz, British Columbia, a teenage girl walked into the darkness believing she was meeting people she knew. Her name was Rena Verk. She was only 14 years old, at an age when most teenagers were worried about school, friendships, family arguments, and the confusing emotions of growing up. Rena was about to become the center of one of the most disturbing criminal cases in Canadian history. The place where it happened was not a battlefield. It was not a dangerous neighborhood known for violence. It was a place where young people gathered, talked, laughed, and tried to find their place in the world. A place that looked ordinary. But that night, something changed. A group of teenagers surrounded one girl. A disagreement became humiliation. Humiliation became violence. And violence became a tragedy that would leave an entire country asking the same painful question. How could something like this happen? For many people who heard Rena Verk's name for the first time, the shock came from one heartbreaking detail. The people involved were teenagers. The person who died was a teenager. This was not a story about strangers hiding in the shadows. It was a story about young people who were still supposed to be learning who they were. It was a story about friendship, rejection, anger, and the dangerous power of wanting to belong. Because long before the night of November 14th, 1997, Rena Verk had already experienced another kind of pain. The pain of feeling invisible. The pain of standing outside a circle of people who seemed to have already decided she did not belong. Rena was born in 1983 in Victoria, British Columbia. She grew up in a family with strong cultural and religious traditions, in an environment where she often felt different from many of the people around her. Like many young people, Rena wanted something simple. She wanted acceptance. She wanted friends who would look at her and see a person, not someone who was different. She wanted to feel like she belonged somewhere. But adolescence can be a cruel period, a time when small comments can become deep wounds, a time when social groups can become powerful, a time when a person's desire to be accepted can sometimes make them ignore the warning signs around them. Those who knew Rena describe her as a young girl who was trying to find herself. She was sensitive, emotional, and searching for connection. But at school and among some groups of teenagers, she became the target of teasing and rejection. The world around her became a place where she constantly felt judged. And that feeling of isolation would become one of the most important parts of the story that followed. The night Rena disappeared did not begin with a clear sign that something terrible was about to happen. There was no dramatic warning, no moment where everyone knew they were witnessing the beginning of a tragedy. It began like many ordinary teenage encounters. A group of young people gathering together, a conversation, a meeting near a familiar location, a moment that seemed like it would pass like any other. But behind the ordinary appearance of that night were emotions that had been building for a long time: anger, jealousy, resentment, the need to impress others, the desire to be accepted by a group. These emotions created an atmosphere where cruelty could grow. And once violence began, the situation moved beyond what anyone could control. According to the investigation, Rena was attacked by several teenagers near the area of Craigflower Bridge in Saenz. She was surrounded. She was beaten. She was humiliated. The people around her were not adults with years of criminal experience. They were young people who still had their entire lives ahead of them. But in that moment, a decision was made that would destroy many lives forever. Rena's life ended that night, but the consequences continued for decades. Her death shocked Canada because it forced people to confront uncomfortable truths. People had to look at the world of teenagers and ask questions that many did not want to face. What happens when bullying is ignored? What happens when a young person feels powerful because others are watching? What happens when a group encourages cruelty instead of stopping it? The case became much more than a murder investigation. It became a national conversation about bullying, social exclusion, and the responsibility of those who stand nearby when something wrong is happening. Many people wondered about the role of the witnesses. Some teenagers were present that night. Some knew pieces of what happened. Some failed to stop it. And this created another painful question. How many tragedies begin not only because someone chooses to harm another person, but because others choose to remain silent? The murder of Rena Verk became a symbol of the dangers hidden inside teenage social groups. A reminder that violence does not always begin with hatred. Sometimes it begins with smaller things. A joke that goes too far. A group trying to prove something. A person being treated as less important. A moment when nobody decides to say, stop. Years later, the name Rena Verk would remain connected to one of Canada's most haunting criminal cases. But before she became a victim, she was a daughter, a friend, a teenager with dreams, a girl who wanted to be accepted. She was not born into a tragedy. She was not defined by the final moments of her life. She was a 14-year-old girl trying to find her place in the world. And the tragedy of Rena Verk is not only that she was killed. The tragedy is that so many people around her failed to see the warning signs before it was too late. Her story begins not with the night she died. It begins with a young girl who wanted to belong. And it is there in the quiet moments before the violence that the darkest questions of this case begin. Part 2. The setting. A quiet community before the storm. Saanich, British Columbia. A place that, for many years, represented the image of a peaceful Canadian community. Located on Vancouver Island near the city of Victoria, Saanich was not the kind of place where people expected a tragedy of this magnitude to unfold. It was a region known for its natural beauty, quiet neighborhoods, parks, and a slower pace of life compared to the larger cities across Canada. The streets were familiar. The people knew their neighbors. Families went to work. Children went to school, and teenagers searched for their own identities just as they did everywhere else. From the outside, it looked like a safe place to grow up. But beneath that calm surface, like many communities, there were struggles that were not always visible. The teenage world has always had its own invisible boundaries. Groups formed, friendships changed, social status became important. Some young people found confidence and belonging. Others found themselves standing on the outside, watching groups they wanted to be part of. For someone like Rena Verk, those invisible walls became increasingly difficult to overcome. The late 1990s were a different time. Before social media dominated teenage life, conflicts often happened face-to-face, in schools, neighborhoods, and small social circles. Reputation was built through conversations in hallways, gatherings after school, and private moments between friends. A rumor could spread quickly. A disagreement could become personal. A person could become isolated without the outside world ever knowing. This was the environment where Rena was trying to find her place. She was growing up between different worlds. At home, she was part of a family with strong values and traditions. Outside, she was surrounded by teenage culture, where acceptance and popularity could sometimes feel like everything. Like many teenagers, Rena wanted to experience freedom. She wanted friendships. She wanted to feel understood. But the teenage years can be a confusing period, especially for someone who already feels different. The need to belong can become powerful. Sometimes people accept situations they know are unhealthy simply because they do not want to be alone. And this desire for acceptance will become a painful part of Rena's story. The groups of teenagers involved in the case came from different backgrounds, but they shared one thing. They were all young people still developing their identities. They were not adults with fully formed lives. They were teenagers navigating emotions, conflicts, and social pressures. But inside a group, individual responsibility can sometimes become blurred. A person may do something they would never do alone because they feel protected by the presence of others. The opinions of the group can become louder than personal judgment. The fear of looking weak can become stronger than the instinct to do what is right. This phenomenon would later become one of the central discussions surrounding the case. How could teenagers become involved in such extreme violence? What role did group pressure play? What happened when the desire to impress others became more important than compassion? These questions would continue to haunt investigators, experts, and the Canadian public for years. Before the tragedy, Rena's life was not defined by the conflict around her. She was still a young girl with ordinary teenage experiences. She had moments of happiness. She had relationships. She had dreams about the future. But she was also a teenager searching for acceptance in a world where she often felt rejected. Those closest to her described a girl who wanted connection. She was someone who wanted people around her who would accept her as she was. Yet the same environment that should have helped her grow became a place where she experienced cruelty. The bullying she faced was not always obvious to everyone around her. Many forms of teenage suffering happen quietly. A person can walk through school corridors surrounded by others and still feel completely alone. A person can laugh with others and still feel unwanted. A person can appear fine while carrying pain that nobody sees. This is one of the reasons the Rena Verk case affected so many people. It forced communities to look beyond what they could see. It showed that violence does not always appear suddenly. Sometimes it develops through a series of smaller moments. Moments where someone is ignored. Moments where someone is humiliated. Moments where people choose not to intervene. By November 1997, the tension surrounding Rena's relationships with some teenagers had reached a dangerous point. The people involved were connected through friendships, conflicts, and social groups. There were disagreements. There were personal struggles. There were emotions that had been building over time. And on the night of November 14th, those tensions came together near Craigflower Bridge. The location itself was ordinary, a place near water, a place where people could gather away from the attention of adults, a place that would later become forever connected to one of Canada's most painful criminal cases. That night, nobody walking to the area could have known what was about to happen. Nobody could have predicted that a teenage gathering would become the scene of a tragedy. Nobody could have imagined that the name Rena Verk would soon be known across the country. The investigation that followed would reveal disturbing details. The courtroom battles would continue for years. The discussions about bullying and youth violence would reshape conversations across Canada. But before all of that, there was only a quiet community, a group of teenagers, and a 14-year-old girl who wanted nothing more than to belong. The tragedy of Rena Verk did not happen in a place everyone feared. It happened in an ordinary place, among ordinary people, and that is what made it even more difficult to understand. Because sometimes the darkest moments in history do not begin in obvious places. Sometimes they begin in the places where people feel safest. Part 3, The Victim's Story. The life of Rena Verk before the tragedy, before the headlines, before the courtroom, before her name became connected to one of the most disturbing criminal cases in Canadian history. There was simply Rena Verk, a 14-year-old girl trying to understand herself and the world around her, a daughter, a friend, a teenager searching for a place where she felt accepted. When people hear about tragic cases, It is easy to remember only the final moments, the violence, the investigation, the people responsible. But before that night in November 1997, Rena had a life that mattered, a life filled with ordinary moments that many people experience while growing up. She had hopes, she had fears, she had dreams that would never have the chance to become reality. Rena was born in 1983 in Victoria, British Columbia, into a family with strong cultural and religious traditions. Her parents had built a life for their family, while carrying the values and expectations that came from their background. Inside her home, there was structure, there were beliefs, there were traditions. But outside her home, Rena was growing up in a world where being different could sometimes feel like a burden. Teenage years are often described as a time of discovery, a time when young people begin to decide who they want to become. But there are also years filled with insecurity. Many teenagers worry about how others see them. They worry about whether they are accepted, whether they are liked, whether they belong. For Rena, those feelings became especially difficult. She was caught between different identities. At home, she had one world. Among her peers, she was trying to find another. She wanted to fit in. She wanted friendships that felt real. She wanted people around her who would understand her. But instead, she often found herself on the outside. People who knew Rena describe her as someone who was sensitive and emotional. She was not someone who wanted conflict. She was a young person trying to navigate complicated relationships and the confusing social world of adolescence. But the teenage environment around her could be unforgiving. Small differences could become reasons for rejection. A person could quickly become labeled, and once a reputation formed, escaping it could be difficult. For Rena, feeling excluded became a painful part of her teenage experience. She was reportedly bullied and mocked by some peers. Words were used against her. She was made to feel like she did not belong. And for a teenager, that kind of rejection can feel overwhelming. At 14 years old, a person is still learning how to understand their own value. The opinions of others can feel extremely powerful. A cruel comment from a classmate can stay in someone's mind for years. A moment of embarrassment can feel impossible to forget. And when someone already feels alone, the desire to be accepted can become stronger than the instinct to protect themselves. This was one of the tragic elements of Rena's story. She wanted connection. She wanted friendship. She wanted to be included. And like many teenagers searching for acceptance, she sometimes moved toward people and situations that were not healthy for her. The people around her were also teenagers. They were young. They were still forming their personalities. They were influenced by friendships, emotions, and social pressure. But the difference between ordinary teenage conflict and destructive cruelty can sometimes become dangerously small when no one steps in. Rena's story became a reminder that bullying is not always just a few mean words. Sometimes it creates an environment where a person begins to believe they are not valued. Sometimes it pushes someone to search for acceptance in places where they may not find safety. Those who study youth behavior often explain that adolescence is a period when belonging can feel like survival. A teenager may tolerate disrespect because they fear being alone. They may ignore warning signs because they want to be part of a group. They may continue chasing acceptance from people who do not truly care about them. Rena was not simply a victim who appeared in a criminal case. She was a teenager with personality, a history, and relationships. She had moments of happiness. She had people who cared about her. She had a family who loved her. Her life was not defined by the tragedy that ended it. That is important because the story of Rena Verk is often told to the events of her death. But her story began much earlier. It began with a young girl growing up in Victoria. A girl experiencing the normal struggles of adolescence. A girl who wanted friends. A girl who wanted to feel seen. A girl who wanted someone to say, "You belong here." The pain of Rena's story is not only that she lost her life, it is that she spent part of that life searching for the acceptance that every young person deserves. Looking back, many people asked whether there were signs, whether someone could have noticed her struggles, whether someone could have reached out. Those questions remain difficult because tragedies like this rarely happen because of one single moment. They often develop through many smaller moments. A person being ignored, a person being hurt, a person feeling alone, a person needing help but not receiving it. Rena's final night will become the most remembered part of her life, but it should never become the only part. She was more than what happened to her. She was more than a news story. She was more than a name connected to a crime. She was a 14-year-old girl who had a future filled with possibilities that disappeared far too soon. And as the world later tried to understand how such a tragedy could happen, one truth remained clear. Before she became the center of a criminal investigation, Rena Verk was simply a young girl who wanted to be accepted, loved, and remembered. Part 4, The Incident, the night everything changed. November 14th, 1997. A night that began like many other nights for teenagers in Saenz, British Columbia. The streets were quiet. The air was cold. The ordinary rhythm of the community continued without anyone knowing that something terrible was about to happen. For 14-year-old Rena Verk, the evening was supposed to be another moment in her teenage life. Another night of trying to connect with people. Another night of searching for acceptance. But instead, it became the final night of her life. The events that unfolded near Craigflower Bridge would later become one of the most shocking criminal cases in Canadian history, not only because of what happened, but because of who was involved. Young people, teenagers, individuals who were still supposed to be learning how to handle anger, conflict, and emotions. Instead, that night became a moment where cruelty took control. Before the violence began, Rena was among a group of teenagers. The exact emotions and conversations that existed in those moments would later become part of investigations and courtroom discussions. What is known is that tensions existed. There were conflicts between Rena and some people around her. There were personal issues. There were complicated relationships. And beneath everything was the pressure of teenage social groups, where reputation and acceptance could feel more important than anything else. The gathering near Craigflower Bridge was not unusual on the surface. Teenagers often look for places away from adults, places where they could talk, spend time together, and feel independent. But that night, the atmosphere changed. A situation that may have started with anger and confrontation moved into something far more dangerous. According to the evidence presented during the investigation, Rena was attacked by a group of teenagers. The violence was not a sudden accident. It involved multiple people, multiple actions, multiple moments where someone could have chosen to stop. The details revealed during the case painted a disturbing picture. Rena was surrounded. She was physically attacked. She was humiliated in front of others. The people involved were not strangers who had randomly encountered her. They were people from the same teenage world she was trying so desperately to enter. That reality made the case even more painful for the public to understand. The danger did not come from a distant, unknown person. It came from within a social environment where Rena was seeking belonging. At some point during the attack, some of the teenagers left the area, but the violence continued. Kelly Ellard and Warren Glowatsky were later identified as two of the main individuals responsible for what happened next. The prosecution argued that Rena was eventually killed during the assault. The 14-year-old girl who had spent so much of her life wanting to be accepted was left alone, injured, and unable to return home. The contrast between the beginning and the end of that night became one of the most haunting parts of the case. A teenager searching for friendship, a group of teenagers choosing violence, a moment that changed countless lives forever. For Rena's family, the hours after she disappeared were filled with fear and confusion. At first, there was uncertainty. There was the possibility that she would come home. There was the hope that she was somewhere safe. Families of missing people often experience a unique kind of pain. The mind creates possibilities. Maybe she is somewhere else. Maybe she will return. Maybe there is an explanation. But as time passed, that hope became harder to hold on to. The discovery of Rena's body days later brought the worst possible answer. The search for a missing teenager became a murder investigation. A family's fear became a reality they would have to carry forever. The news spread quickly. A 14-year-old girl had been killed, and those accused were also teenagers. The public struggled to understand. Parents wondered about their own children. Schools questioned whether warning signs had been missed. Communities began discussing issues that had often been ignored: bullying, peer pressure, youth violence, the responsibility of witnesses. The case forced many people to look at something uncomfortable. Sometimes the most dangerous moments are not created by one person acting alone. Sometimes they are created when a group dynamic removes empathy, when people stop seeing another person as human, when the desire to impress others becomes stronger than the ability to recognize suffering. The tragedy of Rena Verk was not only the violence itself. It was the fact that several young people were present. Several people witnessed events unfolding, and yet the situation was allowed to continue. This became one of the most discussed aspects of the case: the role of bystanders, the people who watch, the people who know something is wrong, the people who have a choice. Do they step forward, or do they stay silent? The answer to that question became one of the lasting lessons of the Rena Verk case, because her death was not only about what happened in those final moments. It was also about all the moments before them, the moments when she felt excluded, the moments when conflicts grew, the moments when people could have chosen compassion instead. Years later, the night of November 14th, 1997 remains a painful reminder of how quickly a situation can become irreversible. A teenage gathering became a crime scene. A young girl became a symbol of the consequences of bullying and violence. A quiet community became the center of national attention. But behind all the headlines and legal discussions was still the same truth. Rena Verk was only 14 years old. She had a family waiting for her. She had a future she never got to experience. And one night of violence took away everything that could have come next. Part 5. The Discovery. The Search for Rena and the First Clues. In the days after November 14, 1997, the quiet streets of Saenz changed. A community that had once felt ordinary was now filled with questions. Where was Rena? What had happened to her? Who was responsible? For her family, every hour without answers became heavier. When a teenager does not come home, the first instinct is often hope. Maybe she is staying with a friend. Maybe her phone is not working. Maybe she will walk through the door and explain everything. Families hold on to those possibilities because the alternative is too painful to accept. But as the hours passed, the concern surrounding Rena's disappearance grew. The situation was no longer just a teenager being late. Something was wrong. Rena had disappeared, and someone had to find out why. The search began in a community that was struggling to understand how a young girl could vanish after spending time with other teenagers. Police began gathering information. They spoke with people who knew Rena. They tried to reconstruct her final movements. They looked into her relationships, her friendships, and the people she had been with that night. Every detail mattered. A conversation, a location, a name, a memory. At first, investigators were working with uncertainty. There was no complete picture. There was only a missing 14-year-old girl and a growing fear that something serious had happened. The investigation moved forward as officers tried to understand the events leading up to Rena's disappearance. The area around Craigflower Bridge became an important part of the search. The location was not unusual. It was a place where teenagers could gather away from the attention of adults. But after Rena disappeared, the same place became connected to a tragedy that would forever change the community. Search teams examined areas near the water and surrounding locations. They looked for anything that could explain where Rena had gone. Days passed, and then the investigation reached the moment every family fears. Rena's body was discovered near the water in the Skimmel Harbor area. The hope that she would return home alive was gone. The search for a missing teenager became a homicide investigation. For investigators, the discovery raised more questions than answers. How did a 14-year-old girl end up there? Who had been with her? Why did people who were supposed to be her peers turn against her? The scene revealed that this was not a simple disappearance. The circumstances surrounding Rena's death pointed toward a violent attack. Investigators began focusing on the events of the night she vanished. They started looking closely at the teenagers who had been connected to her, the people who were with her, the people who knew what happened, the people who might have answers. The investigation became more complicated because many of those involved were young. They were not experienced criminals. They were teenagers who had their own stories, their own fears, and their own relationships. But the evidence suggested that something terrible had happened, and the truth would have to be uncovered. Detectives began interviewing witnesses. They listened to different versions of events. They compared stories. They looked for contradictions. In cases involving groups of people, investigators face a unique challenge. Everyone may remember the same moment differently. Some people may leave out details. Some may minimize their own involvement. Some may blame others. Finding the truth requires patience. Every statement must be examined. Every detail must be questioned. The investigation also brought attention to the role of those who were present that night. Some teenagers had knowledge of what happened. Some had information about the attack. This raised one of the most difficult questions in the entire case. Why did no one stop it? Why did no one immediately seek help? Why did a group of young people allow violence to continue? Those questions would follow the case for years. As investigators worked to understand what happened, the story of Rena Verk began spreading across Canada. People were shocked not only by the loss of a young life, but by the circumstances surrounding it. A teenage girl had been killed, and the people accused were also teenagers. The public struggled to understand how a group of young people could become involved in such violence. The case became a symbol of a much larger conversation. It was no longer only about one night. It was about bullying, about exclusion, about the pressure young people feel to fit in, about what happens when cruelty is ignored. The discovery of Rena's body marked a turning point. Before that moment, the community was searching for a missing girl. After that moment, everyone was searching for the truth. Investigators now had a crime scene. They had a victim. They had a timeline they needed to reconstruct. The work of uncovering what happened had only begun. Every piece of evidence would matter. Every witness would matter. Every decision made during that night would be examined. The quiet area near Craigflower Bridge, once just another place in Saenz, had become the center of a case that would define discussions about youth violence in Canada. And at the heart of it all was still the same heartbreaking reality. A 14-year-old girl was gone. A family was grieving. And an entire country wanted to know how it could have happened. Part 6. The Suspect in the Dead Ends. Searching for the Truth. After Rena Verk's body was discovered, the investigation entered a new and more difficult stage. The question was no longer whether something terrible had happened. It had. The question was, who was responsible? For detectives, the answer would not come easily. The case involved a group of teenagers, conflicting stories, and a night where many people knew something had happened, but not everyone was willing to speak openly. The investigation became a complicated search through friendships, conflicts, and hidden emotions. Every person connected to Rena became important. Every conversation from the days before her death was examined. Every relationship was questioned. The police began looking closely at the group of teenagers who had been with Rena that night. At first, investigators had to separate rumors from facts. Teenage social circles can be complicated. Friendships change quickly. Arguments can become intense. People can exaggerate stories or hide information to protect themselves or others. But behind all of those complicated relationships was one undeniable fact. Rena had been attacked by people who knew her. This was not a random encounter with a stranger. The people involved were part of the same social environment. They knew each other. They shared connections. And that meant the investigation had to focus on understanding those relationships. One of the names that quickly became central was Kelly Ellard. She was a teenager who had been connected to the events of that night. Another important figure was Warren Glowatsky. Both would later become key figures in the legal case surrounding Rena's death. But before the courtroom battles, investigators had to uncover exactly what happened. The challenge was that the truth was hidden behind different versions of events. Some teenagers admitted parts of what happened. Others tried to distance themselves. Some claimed they were not directly responsible. This created a difficult situation for investigators. A group crime is often harder to understand because responsibility can become divided. One person may start something. Another person may encourage it. Someone else may simply watch. But each person's role becomes a critical question. What did they know? What did they do? What could they have stopped? These questions became central to the investigation. As detectives continued their work, the public began learning more about the disturbing details surrounding Rena's final hours. The case shocked Canada because it challenged the way people thought about youth violence. Many people wanted a simple explanation. They wanted to know how teenagers could become involved in such a brutal attack. But the reality was more complicated. There was no single answer. The investigation revealed a combination of personal conflicts, social pressure, and a group environment where violence was allowed to happen. The case also highlighted the problem of bullying and exclusion. For years, Rena had struggled with feeling accepted. The investigation showed that the tragedy did not happen in isolation. It developed in a world of teenage relationships where emotions could become extreme, and where people sometimes made choices based on wanting approval from others. As detectives interviewed witnesses, they faced another major challenge. Some people who were present that night were afraid to talk. Fear, loyalty, and the desire to avoid consequences can all influence what witnesses choose to reveal. A person may know something important but hesitate to share it. They may worry about what others will think. They may fear becoming involved. This created delays and uncertainty. But investigators continued. They followed every lead. They examined every statement. They searched for the details that could reveal the truth. The community watched closely as the case developed. Parents wondered how something like this could happen among young people. Schools began discussing bullying and violence more openly. The name Rena Verk became connected to a national conversation about responsibility. Not only the responsibility of those who committed violence, but also the responsibility of those who saw warning signs and did nothing. The idea of the bystander became one of the most painful parts of the case. A person does not have to throw the first punch to be part of a tragedy. Sometimes silence can allow harm to continue. Sometimes fear can prevent someone from acting. And sometimes a group can make individuals forget their own sense of right and wrong. As the investigation continued, detectives slowly began building a clearer picture. The events of November 14th were no longer just a mystery. They were becoming a timeline, a series of decisions, a series of actions, a series of moments that led to the death of a 14-year-old girl. The case moved forward toward the courtroom. But first, investigators needed to establish exactly who was responsible and how much each person had contributed to what happened. The search for answers was not only about proving guilt, it was about giving Rena's family the truth they had been waiting for. Because behind every piece of evidence was the same painful reality. A daughter was gone, a family was grieving, and somewhere inside the stories being told, the truth about that night was still waiting to be uncovered. The investigation continued. The questions remained. And slowly, the hidden details of the tragedy began to emerge. Part 7, The Breakthrough, the evidence that revealed the truth. As the investigation into Rena Verk's death continued, police began to uncover the details that would eventually transform the case from a mystery into a criminal prosecution. The first days had been filled with uncertainty. A young girl was dead. A group of teenagers was connected to the events. But investigators still needed to understand exactly what happened, who played what role, and how a gathering between teenagers became a violent attack. The breakthrough did not come from one single moment. It came from many pieces coming together. Statements, witness accounts, contradictions, small details that, when placed together, created a clearer picture of the night Rena lost her life. One of the most important parts of the investigation was the information provided by people who had been near the events. Some teenagers who were connected to the group eventually began revealing what they knew. The story that emerged was disturbing. Rena had not simply disappeared. She had been surrounded by a group. She had been targeted. And several people had knowledge of what happened. The investigation began focusing more intensely on the individuals who were believed to have been directly involved. Among them were Kelly Ellard and Warren Glowatsky. The evidence suggested that after Rena was attacked by a group of teenagers, the violence continued after some of the others had left. This detail became a major part of the prosecution's argument. The question was no longer only who had been present. The question was who had continued the attack, who had taken actions that led to Rena's death. As detectives built the timeline, they examined the events step by step. They looked at what happened before the attack. They looked at the relationships between the teenagers. They looked at the emotions and conflicts that existed within the group. The investigation revealed that this was not a random act. There were personal tensions involved. There were social dynamics involved. There was a group environment where violence was allowed to escalate. The case became a powerful example of how complicated group crimes can be. When multiple people are involved, responsibility is not always easy to determine. Each person may have a different level of involvement. Some may encourage. Some may participate directly. Some may remain silent. But the law must examine each action carefully. The investigators also had to consider the credibility of witnesses. Teenagers who had been present that night had to explain their actions. Some accounts changed over time. Some details became clearer. Some statements raised new questions. The process required investigators to separate truth from fear, from loyalty, from attempts to protect oneself. This was one of the most challenging parts of the case, because the people who knew the most about what happened were also connected to it. They were not distant observers. They were part of the same social world as Rena. As the investigation developed, the public became increasingly focused on the issue of bullying and youth violence. Many people began asking whether Rena's death could have been prevented. Were there warning signs? Were there adults who could have noticed something was wrong? Could someone have intervened before the situation became deadly? These questions did not have simple answers, but they became an important part of the national conversation. The case showed that violence among young people does not appear out of nowhere. It can grow from patterns of behavior, from cruelty that is ignored, from conflicts that are never properly addressed, from environments where people feel pressure to follow the group. The investigation eventually led authorities toward criminal charges. The evidence gathered pointed toward specific individuals who would later face trial. For Rena's family, this moment represented a painful step forward. They finally had confirmation that the truth was moving closer. But finding answers could never bring Rena back. No court decision could erase the image of a 14-year-old girl who would never grow older. No punishment could replace the future she lost. Still, the search for justice continued, because the purpose of an investigation is not only to identify who caused harm, it is also to recognize the life that was taken. Rena was not just a victim in a legal case. She was a person whose story mattered, and the evidence gathered during the investigation ensured that her final moments would not remain hidden. The case moved toward the courtroom. The questions that had surrounded the community for months would finally be examined publicly. The teenagers accused of involvement would have to face the consequences of their actions, and Canada would watch as one of its most painful criminal cases entered its next chapter. The truth had taken time to emerge, but step by step, the silence surrounding that night was beginning to break. Part 8, The Justice, the Trials and the Search for Accountability. After months of investigation, the story of Rena Verk's death moved from the streets of Saenz into the courtroom. The place where the truth would be examined was no longer a dark area near Craigflower Bridge. It was a courtroom, a place where evidence would be presented, where witnesses would speak, where the actions of a group of teenagers would be judged. For Rena's family, the trials represented a painful but necessary step. They had already experienced the unimaginable loss of a daughter. Now they had to sit through the details of the final moments of her life. The legal process would not bring Rena back, but it could answer some of the questions that had remained since that night. Who was responsible? What exactly happened? Why did a group of young people allow such violence to occur? The first major trial focused on Warren Glowatsky. The prosecution argued that Glowatsky had been directly involved in Rena's death. The evidence presented in court described the attack and the events leading up to it. The jury heard about the group of teenagers who had gathered that night. They heard about the violence. They heard about the actions that followed. The courtroom became the place where the events of November 14th, 1997 were reconstructed piece by piece. Witnesses were asked to remember moments that were difficult to describe. The defense and prosecution examined different interpretations of what happened. This is the nature of a criminal trial. A courtroom does not simply ask whether something terrible occurred. Everyone already knew that Rena had died, The question was whether the evidence proved who was legally responsible. The jury had to consider every detail carefully, every statement, every piece of evidence, every explanation. In 1999, Warren Glowatsky was convicted of second-degree murder. The verdict marked a major moment in the case. For Rena's family, it represented recognition that someone had been held accountable for what happened to their daughter. But the legal process did not end there. The case involving Kelly Ellard became one of the most closely watched criminal proceedings in Canada. Her trials would become a long and complicated legal battle. The prosecution argued that Ellard played a direct role in Rena's death. The defense challenged aspects of the evidence and questioned how events had been interpreted. The case moved through different stages over many years. There were convictions. There were appeals. There were new legal discussions. Each stage brought the case back into public attention. For many Canadians, the repeated court proceedings reflected how complicated the justice system can be. A person's guilt must be proven through evidence. A conviction must follow legal standards. And even in cases involving shocking crimes, the courts must carefully examine every detail. The case also raised difficult questions about young offenders. The people involved were teenagers. They were young enough that many people struggled to understand how such violence could occur. At the same time, the seriousness of Rena's death demanded accountability. The justice system had to balance two realities. The individuals involved were young, but the consequences of their actions were permanent. Rena would never return home. Her family would never see her grow older. The trials also kept the issue of bullying and youth violence in the national conversation. The courtroom was not only examining a murder, it was examining a culture where humiliation and social pressure could become dangerous. Experts discussed how group dynamics can influence behavior, how people sometimes act differently when surrounded by others, how the desire to impress a group can overcome personal judgment. The tragedy of Rena Verk became more than a legal case. It became a warning about what can happen when cruelty is ignored, a warning about the importance of intervention, a warning about the responsibility people have when they witness harm. After years of legal battles, Kelly Ellard was ultimately held responsible for her role in Rena's death. The convictions brought a sense of closure to the legal process. But closure is a complicated word for families who have lost someone. A sentence does not erase grief. A courtroom decision does not undo the past. The empty space left by a loved one remains. For Rena's parents and family, justice was not about celebration. It was about acknowledgement. It was about the world recognizing that their daughter mattered, that her life had value, that what happened to her could not simply be forgotten. The case of Rena Verk remains one of the most painful examples of youth violence in Canadian history because the people involved were so young. It forced society to look at uncomfortable realities. A teenager can be both vulnerable and capable of causing harm. A group of young people can create an environment where violence becomes possible. And a community can sometimes fail to notice suffering until it is too late. The courtroom provided answers, but it also left lasting questions. Questions about prevention, questions about responsibility, questions about how to protect young people from becoming victims or participants in violence. The justice system had reached its decisions. The trials were over. But the conversation created by Rena's death continued, because some cases end with a verdict. Others continue through the lessons they leave behind. And the story of Rena Verk became one of those cases. A story where justice was achieved in court, but where the search for understanding continued far beyond it. Part 9, The Aftermath, the legacy of Rena Verk's story. Years passed after the night of November 14, 1997. The courtroom battles ended. The headlines became less frequent. The public attention slowly moved toward other stories. But for the people who knew Rena Verk, the pain did not disappear. A legal case can end. A sentence can be delivered. A trial can be closed. But grief does not follow the same timeline. For Rena's family, life continued with a permanent absence. A place at the table that would never be filled again. A voice they would never hear again. A daughter who would never experience the future that should have belonged to her. Rena was only 14 years old when her life ended. She never had the opportunity to grow older. She never had the chance to discover who she would become. She never experienced the ordinary moments that many people take for granted. Graduation, new friendships, dreams becoming reality. The simple process of growing up, all of those possibilities disappeared on one tragic night. But while the loss remained deeply personal for her family, Rena's story also became something larger. It became a symbol of the consequences of bullying, a symbol of the dangers of group violence, a symbol of what can happen when people choose silence instead of action. After the case, schools, communities, and organizations across Canada began discussing youth violence in new ways. The questions became more serious. How do teenagers treat each other? How do we recognize when someone is being isolated? How do we stop bullying before it becomes something more dangerous? These questions were not easy to answer because bullying is not always visible. Sometimes it happens through words, through exclusion, through humiliation, through making someone feel like they do not matter. And those wounds can be difficult to see from the outside. The story of Rena Verk reminded people that emotional pain can be just as important to address as physical harm. A person who feels rejected or alone may carry struggles that others never notice. A teenager who appears fine may be dealing with experiences that are deeply painful. This is one of the reasons the case continued to be discussed decades later. It was not only about what happened on one night. It was about everything that led to that moment. It was about the environment around young people. It was about how friendships can influence choices. It was about the responsibility of individuals and communities to protect those who are vulnerable. One of the most powerful lessons from the case was the importance of speaking up. The people around us matter. A simple act of kindness can change someone's experience. A decision to intervene can prevent harm. A willingness to notice someone who feels invisible can make a difference. Rena spent part of her teenage life searching for acceptance. Her story reminds people that belonging should never require someone to lose their dignity. No one should have to prove they deserve respect. No one should be made to feel worthless because they are different. The tragedy of Rena Verk also changed the way many people looked at youth crime. Before this case, many people imagined serious violence as something committed by adults. But Rena's death forced society to confront a difficult reality. Young people can also become involved in devastating acts. And understanding why that happens is necessary if future tragedies are to be prevented. The goal is not only to punish after something terrible occurs. The goal is to recognize warning signs before a life is lost. The name Rena Verk remains connected to a painful chapter in Canadian history, but her memory should not only exist through the details of the crime. She should be remembered as a young girl, a daughter, a person with feelings, hopes, and dreams. Her life was more than the way it ended. The tragedy surrounding her death created a national conversation, but behind that conversation was a real person who mattered. A teenager who wanted friendship, a teenager who wanted acceptance, a teenager who deserved a chance to grow. More than 2 decades later, the case continues to remind people that actions have consequences. A moment of anger can change lives forever. A choice made in a group can create unimaginable damage, and silence can sometimes become part of the problem. The story of Rena Verk remains painful because it asks questions that do not have simple answers. Could someone have stopped it? Could someone have noticed sooner? Could a different choice have changed everything? Those questions may never have complete answers, but they continue to encourage reflection. They continue to remind communities to pay attention, to listen, to care, because every young person deserves to feel safe. Every young person deserves to feel valued. Every young person deserves to believe that they belong. Rena Verk's story began as a tragedy, but the way people remember her can become something different. A reminder, a lesson, a reason to create a world where fewer people feel alone. Because behind every case, behind every headline, behind every investigation, there is always a human life. And Rena's life mattered. Part 10, Beyond the Case, the questions that remain. More than 2 decades after the death of Rena Verk, her name continues to be remembered across Canada. The details of the case remain painful. A 14-year-old girl, a group of teenagers, a night of violence that changed countless lives. But as time passes, the story of Rena Verk has become about more than the crime itself. It has become about the questions that remained after courtroom doors closed. Questions about childhood. Questions about responsibility. Questions about how society protects young people. And perhaps the most difficult question of all, how could a child become both the victim and the center of such a tragedy? Rena's story forces people to look beyond the simple idea of good and evil. The world often wants clear answers. A villain, a victim, a beginning, an ending. But real human stories are often more complicated. The people involved were teenagers living through a period of emotional growth and confusion. They were young people who were still learning how their choices affected others. Yet one night of violence created consequences that would last forever. For Rena, there was no second chance. For her family, there was no way to return to the life they had before. For the teenagers involved, their actions would define their futures. The case became a reminder that moments of cruelty are not always isolated moments. They can come from a combination of influences: the desire to impress others, the need to belong, the fear of being rejected by a group, the failure to understand the seriousness of a situation before it becomes irreversible. This is what made the Rena Verk case so deeply disturbing. It showed how quickly ordinary teenage conflicts can move into something dangerous when empathy disappears. A person can become a target. A group can become powerful. A crowd can make individuals feel less responsible. And when no one chooses to stop what is happening, the consequences can become devastating. The legacy of Rena's story is strongly connected to the discussion of bullying. But bullying is not only about obvious acts of aggression. It can also exist in quieter ways. A person being excluded, a person being constantly judged, a person being treated as if they do not matter. These experiences may seem small to outsiders, but for the person living through them, they can become deeply painful. Rena's life showed why those experiences should never be ignored. A teenager who feels invisible may not always ask for help. A teenager who is struggling may not always show it. Sometimes the signs are hidden. Sometimes they appear only in small changes. A change in behavior, a change in friendships, a withdrawal from others. The case encouraged many people to pay closer attention to those signs, not because every difficult moment leads to tragedy, but because every young person deserves support before they reach a point of hopelessness. Another important lesson from Rena's story is the responsibility of witnesses, the people standing nearby, the people who hear something, the people who see someone being hurt. A person does not need to be the one causing harm to influence what happens next. Sometimes one person speaking up can change the direction of an event. Sometimes one person deciding that something is wrong can make a difference. The silence of bystanders became one of the most discussed aspects of the case because it reflected a larger human problem. People sometimes believe someone else will act. People sometimes fear becoming involved. People sometimes convince themselves that a situation is not their responsibility. But Rena's story showed the importance of understanding that everyone has a role in creating safer communities. The years after the case also showed that justice has many forms. The courtroom provided legal answers, but healing required more than convictions. It required conversations. It required education. It required communities to examine their own behavior. A criminal case can tell us what happened, but society must still ask why it happened. And more importantly, how to prevent something similar from happening again. Rena Verk's name continues to be spoken because her story represents something larger than one night. It represents the importance of kindness, the importance of noticing others, the importance of remembering that every person carries experiences we may not see. Behind every teenager is a story. Behind every person is a struggle that may remain hidden. And sometimes the smallest act of compassion can have a much greater impact than we realize. The tragedy of Rena Verk cannot be changed. The past cannot be rewritten. The questions surrounding that night may never disappear completely, but the way people respond to her story can still create change. Her life can continue to matter, not because of how it ended, but because of the reminder it leaves behind, that young people need guidance, that communities need awareness, that silence can be dangerous, and that every person deserves to be treated with dignity. Rena Verk was 14 years old. She should have had years ahead of her. She should have had the chance to grow, change, discover herself, and experience life beyond adolescence. She was never supposed to become a name remembered because of a tragedy. She was supposed to become someone with a future. And perhaps the most important way to honor her memory is to remember that before she became part of a criminal case, she was simply Rena, a daughter, a young girl, a human being whose life had value, and whose story continues to remind the world that every life matters. Part 11. The Shadow of a Tragedy. Understanding the human stories behind the case. The story of Rena Verk did not end when the court reached its decisions. For many people watching the case unfold, the trials provided a conclusion. There were verdicts, there were sentences, there were legal answers. But for those who were closest to the tragedy, especially Rena's family, the reality was much more complicated. A courtroom can decide responsibility. It can recognize what happened. It can acknowledge the harm caused. But it cannot restore the person who was lost. It cannot bring back the sound of a loved one's voice. It cannot return the moments that were taken away. For Rena's family, the years after her death meant learning how to live with an absence that could never truly disappear. Every family has memories built from ordinary moments. A conversation, a smile, a small habit, a familiar presence in the home. Those are the things people miss most after a loss. Not only the major moments, but the everyday ones. The moments that once seemed unimportant become the memories that remain forever. Rena was remembered not only as the girl at the center of a famous criminal case. She was remembered as a daughter, a teenager, someone who had her own personality, emotions, and dreams. Her family carried the painful reality that the world knew her because of the way she died, while they knew her because of the way she lived. This difference is one of the hardest parts of tragic cases. The public sees the event. Families remember the person. For many years after the case, Rena's name continued to appear in discussions about bullying and youth violence. Educators, parents, and communities examined what her story revealed about the struggles young people can face. The case showed that violence among teenagers is not always caused by one simple reason. There can be many layers: a desire to be accepted, a fear of rejection, a need for attention, anger that is never properly managed, a group environment where people encourage behavior they might not choose alone. Understanding these factors does not excuse what happened. Instead, it helps explain why prevention is so important, because by the time a tragedy occurs, it is already too late for the person who has been harmed. The challenge is recognizing problems before they become irreversible. Rena's story also changed the way many people thought about the word bullying. For a long time, some people viewed bullying as something temporary, a normal part of growing up, something teenagers simply experienced and moved past. But cases like Rena's forced society to understand that repeated humiliation, exclusion, and cruelty can have serious consequences. The emotional world of teenagers can be intense. Friendships can feel like everything. Acceptance can feel like survival. A person who feels rejected may become desperate to find a place where they belong. And sometimes that search can lead them toward people who do not have their best interests at heart. Rena's experience reflected the painful reality of many young people who struggle silently. The teenager who sits alone, the student who changes behavior, the person who stops asking for help because they believe no one will listen. These situations may seem small from the outside, but they can be signs that someone needs support. The case also created discussions about the responsibility of schools and communities. How should adults respond when young people show signs of conflict? How can schools create environments where students feel safe reporting problems? How can teenagers be taught that being a witness means having responsibility? These questions remain important because preventing violence is not only about reacting after tragedy. It is about creating conditions where people are less likely to become victims or perpetrators. The story of Rena Verk continues to be studied because it represents a difficult truth. People do not exist separately from the communities around them. The behavior of one person can affect others. The silence of many people can allow harmful situations to continue. But compassion can also spread. A person who chooses kindness can influence someone's life. A person who chooses to speak can interrupt a harmful situation. A person who chooses to care can remind someone that they are not invisible. Rena's death became a national conversation because people wanted to understand how such a tragedy could happen. But perhaps the more important question is not only how it happened, it is what people choose to do after learning from it. Do they ignore the warning signs? Do they say that something is someone else's problem? Or do they recognize that every person has a role in protecting others? More than 20 years later, the case still carries emotional weight because the central image remains impossible to forget. A 14-year-old girl whose life ended before she had the chance to discover who she could become. The tragedy was not only that Rena died. The tragedy was that she was still becoming herself. She was still growing, still learning, still searching for her place in the world. Her future was taken before she could experience it, and that is why her story continues to matter. Not because of the crime alone, not because of the courtroom, but because behind every case is a person. Behind every headline is a life. And behind the name Rena Verk was a young girl who deserved more time, more kindness, and more understanding than the world gave her. Part 12. The Questions of Responsibility. What Rena Verk's case taught Canada. The case of Rena Verk left behind something that was much larger than a criminal investigation. It created a national conversation about responsibility. Not only the responsibility of the people who directly cause harm, but also the responsibility of everyone who surrounds young people, parents, teachers, friends, communities, and the teenagers themselves. Because one of the most painful questions connected to Rena's death was not only who did this, it was also how did so many warning signs exist before anyone stopped it? The answer was complicated. Tragedies like this rarely come from one single moment. They often develop slowly, through small actions, small choices, small failures to respond. A cruel comment that is ignored, a person being excluded from a group, a conflict that continues without intervention, a teenager who feels unwanted and searches for acceptance somewhere else. Each moment may appear insignificant on its own, but together, they can create an environment where something much more serious becomes possible. Rena's case forced many people to think about the importance of early intervention, because by the time violence happens, the opportunity to prevent it has already passed. The focus then becomes justice. But prevention requires something different. It requires attention. It requires listening. It requires noticing the people who may be struggling quietly. One of the reasons the case remained so powerful was because the people involved were young. Many Canadians found it difficult to understand how teenagers could become connected to such a serious act of violence. There was a natural desire to believe that young people are innocent, that childhood and adolescence represent a protected stage of life. But Rena's story showed that young people can also experience intense emotions, conflicts, and pressures that need guidance. Teenagers are still developing. They are learning how to control emotions, how to understand consequences, how to make decisions, and the environment around them can have a powerful influence. A group can encourage kindness, but a group can also encourage cruelty. A friendship can provide support, but a desire to belong can also lead someone toward harmful choices. The case became an example of how powerful peer pressure can be. Many people want to feel accepted. They want to be part of something. For teenagers especially, social status can feel extremely important. The fear of being rejected can influence decisions. Sometimes people do things they would not do alone because they want approval from others. This does not remove personal responsibility. Every individual is responsible for their own choices. But understanding these pressures is important because it helps explain how certain situations develop. It helps society identify risks before they become tragedies. The role of bystanders became another major issue connected to Rena's story. A person watching violence happen faces a choice. They can walk away, they can remain silent, or they can act. The decision is not always easy. Fear can influence people. They may worry about becoming a target. They may believe someone else will help. They may convince themselves that the situation is not their responsibility. But the case of Rena Verk showed why those moments matter. Silence can allow harm to continue. Even one person stepping forward can change what happens next. This became one of the strongest messages connected to her story. People often think that preventing tragedy requires a dramatic action, but sometimes it begins with something simple: asking if someone is okay, reporting harmful behavior, refusing to participate in cruelty, standing beside someone who feels alone. Small actions can create safety. Small actions can remind people that they matter. After the case, many communities across Canada increased conversations about bullying prevention and youth relationships. Schools placed greater attention on creating environments where students could speak openly. The goal was not only to punish those who cause harm, it was to prevent future situations where someone could become isolated and vulnerable. Because every young person deserves to feel protected. Every young person deserves to have someone who notices when they are struggling. Every young person deserves to know that they belong. The story of Rena Verk also challenged society to think about how victims are remembered. Often, when people talk about criminal cases, they focus on the actions of the offender, the investigation, the trial, the punishment. But behind every case is someone whose life was changed forever. Rena was not defined by the violence that ended her life. She was a teenager with her own experiences, her own personality, her own dreams. Remembering that is important, because justice is not only about understanding what happened, it is also about honoring who was lost. The years after Rena's death showed that a tragedy can create change, but change requires continued effort. A conversation is only meaningful if it leads to action. Awareness is only valuable if it changes behavior. The lessons from Rena's story continue because the issues connected to it still exist. Young people still experience bullying. Some still feel isolated. Some still struggle to ask for help. And communities still face the challenge of responding before it is too late. The legacy of Rena Verk is therefore not only a reminder of a painful night in 1997, it is a reminder of the choices people make every day. The choice to include someone. The choice to show kindness. The choice to speak when something is wrong. Because sometimes the difference between tragedy and hope begins with one person deciding not to remain silent. Part 13. The Memory of Rena, a life remembered beyond the tragedy. When people hear the name Rena Verk, many immediately think about the tragedy. They think about the crime. They think about the investigation. They think about the courtroom and the people who were held responsible. But for those who loved her, Rena was never just a name connected to a case. She was a person, a daughter, a teenager, a young girl who had an entire life before the world knew her story. This is perhaps one of the most important parts of remembering victims of crime. A person should never become only the event that took them away. Before the headlines, before the questions, before the investigation, there was Rena, a girl growing up in Victoria, a girl trying to understand herself, a girl experiencing the confusing emotions that come with being young. Like many teenagers, she was searching for where she belonged. She was trying to find friendships. She was trying to understand the world around her. She was trying to discover who she was. Those ordinary experiences are what make her story so painful. Because Rena's life was not supposed to end at 14. She was supposed to have more time, more memories, more opportunities, more moments that would shape the person she could become. The tragedy of losing someone young is not only losing the person they were, it is losing everything they could have become, a future that will never happen, dreams that will never be completed, stories that will never be told. For Rena's family, the years after her death meant carrying those unanswered possibilities. What would she have been like as an adult? What interests would she have developed? What kind of person would she have become? Those questions are common among families who lose someone too soon. They imagine the future that was taken away. They remember the past that remains, and they continue living with the space left behind. The public often remembers the most dramatic parts of a case, the moments that appear in newspapers, the details discussed in court. But families remember different things. They remember personality. They remember habits. They remember the small details that never appear in official records. The way someone laughed, the way someone spoke, the way someone made a home feel different simply by being there. Those are the memories that keep a person alive in the hearts of those who love them. Over time, Rena Verk became more than a victim in a criminal case. Her story became connected to efforts to create safer environments for young people. Schools and communities continued discussing the importance of kindness, inclusion, and awareness. The goal was to ensure that young people who feel isolated are not ignored, because one of the painful lessons from Rena's story is that people can suffer quietly. Someone can feel alone while surrounded by others. Someone can struggle without anyone understanding the depth of that struggle. Someone can be searching for acceptance while hiding their pain. This is why remembering Rena matters. Her story encourages people to look beyond appearances, to ask questions, to listen, to notice those who may feel invisible. The tragedy also changed conversations about how young people interact with one another. Teenage conflicts are often dismissed as temporary. People sometimes say that young people will eventually move on. But Rena's case showed that the social world of teenagers can have serious emotional consequences. The need to belong is powerful. The desire to be accepted is human. But no one should have to sacrifice their dignity to find friendship. No one should have to accept cruelty in exchange for being included. The memory of Rena became a reminder that every young person deserves respect, not because of what they achieve, not because of how popular they are, simply because they are human. The years have passed, but the questions surrounding her death continue to influence discussions about youth safety. Parents still think about how to support their children. Teachers still think about how to recognize warning signs. Communities still think about how to create places where young people feel valued. These conversations are part of Rena's legacy, a painful legacy born from tragedy, but one that continues to encourage change. Her story reminds people that behind every statistic is an individual. Behind every news report is a family. Behind every case file is a person who had hopes and dreams. Rena was not a symbol when she was alive. She was a real person. And perhaps the greatest way to honor her is to remember her as one, not only as a teenager whose death shocked Canada, but as the girl who wanted what so many people want, to be accepted, to be understood, to be loved. Her life was short, but the conversations created by her story continue. And every time someone chooses kindness over cruelty, every time someone notices a person who feels alone, every time someone decides to speak instead of remain silent, the lessons from Rena's life continue. Because although her future was taken away, her story still has the power to influence the future of others. Part 14, The Long Road After Justice. Healing reflection and the meaning of Rena's story. When a criminal case reaches its conclusion, many people believe the story is finished. The verdict is announced. The legal process ends. The names of those responsible become part of history. But for the families left behind, there is no final chapter. There is no moment when grief simply disappears. For Rena Verk's family, justice was only one part of a much longer journey. The courts could determine responsibility. They could recognize what happened. They could create consequences for those involved. But they could not return the life that had been taken. They could not bring back the 14-year-old girl who had walked out one evening and never came home. They could not erase the memories of the years before the tragedy. And they could not remove the questions that remain after losing someone so young. The aftermath of Rena's death became a story about survival, about how people continue living after experiencing something that changes them forever. For her family, every passing year carried the same painful reality. Time moved forward. The world continued. But Rena remained 14 years old forever. She would never grow older. She would never experience the next stages of life that everyone expected her to reach. This is one of the deepest wounds carried by families who lose children. They do not only mourn the person they knew, they mourn the future that disappeared. They mourn the birthdays that will never happen, the conversations they will never have, the memories that will never be created. The case also left a permanent mark on Canadian society. Many people began looking more closely at the hidden struggles teenagers experience. The pressure to fit in, the fear of rejection, the need for approval, the pain of being excluded. Before Rena's death, Many people viewed these issues as normal parts of growing up. Arguments between teenagers, social conflicts, friendship problems. But her story showed that these situations should never simply be ignored. Behind what appears to be ordinary teenage conflict, there can sometimes be deeper problems. A young person may be suffering. A young person may feel powerless. A young person may be looking for acceptance in unhealthy places. The tragedy encouraged many communities to think differently about prevention. Instead of waiting until something terrible happens, people began discussing the importance of noticing problems earlier, creating safer schools, supporting students who feel isolated, teaching young people about empathy and responsibility. These changes did not come from a simple solution. There is no single answer that can prevent every tragedy, but awareness became an important step. The story of Rena Verk also influenced conversations about how society views young offenders. The people involved were teenagers. That reality created difficult discussions. Many people struggle with the idea that young people could commit such a serious act of violence. Others focus on the fact that young people are still developing and need guidance. The case forced society to consider both realities at the same time. Young people can make devastating choices, but young people can also change. They can learn. They can take responsibility. They can become different people from who they were during a moment of terrible decision-making. These questions were not easy, but they were necessary, because understanding youth crime requires more than anger. It requires examining the circumstances, influences, and environments that shape young lives. The case also remained a powerful reminder of the importance of community. A person's life is influenced by the people around them, the words people use, the way people treat each other, the decisions people make when they witness something wrong. A community is not only a place, it is the people within it. And those people have the ability to create either safety or harm. Rena's story became a reminder that kindness is not a small thing. A simple act of inclusion can mean more than people realize. A person who feels ignored may remember the one person who treated them with compassion. A person who feels alone may be changed by someone who chooses to reach out. The tragedy of Rena Verk cannot be undone. Nothing can change the events of that night, but the meaning people take from her story can influence the future. That is why her case continues to be discussed, not because of the violence, but because of the lessons that came afterward. Lessons about responsibility. Lessons about empathy. Lessons about the importance of seeing people before they become invisible. More than 25 years later, Rena's name still carries emotional weight. For some, she represents the painful consequences of bullying. For others, she represents the need for stronger support systems for young people. For her family, she represents something much more personal. She represents a daughter who was loved, a girl who mattered, a life that ended far too soon. The greatest danger in remembering tragic cases is allowing the victim to disappear behind the details of what happened. Rena was not just a victim of a crime. She was a person who had dreams. She had emotions. She had a place in her family. She had a story before the tragedy. And that story deserves to be remembered, because every name connected to a tragedy belongs to someone. Every person lost had people who cared about them. Every life had meaning, and the story of Rena Verk continues to remind the world of one simple truth. Before anyone becomes part of a headline, they are first a human being. Part 15, The Final Reflection, a story that Canada never forgot. Some cases disappear from public memory with time. The names become distant. The details become forgotten. The emotions fade as new stories replace old ones. But the case of Rena Verk remained. More than 25 years after that tragic night, people still remember her name, not only because of what happened, but because of what her story revealed about society, about young people, about loneliness, about the importance of compassion. Rena's death became one of the most painful reminders that violence does not always begin with a single moment. Sometimes it begins long before. It can begin with someone feeling rejected, with someone being treated as less important, with cruelty that becomes normal because no one challenges it, with people watching and deciding not to act. The events surrounding Rena's death forced many people to look at uncomfortable realities. A group of teenagers had gathered together. A young girl had been targeted. And a situation that may have started as conflict became something irreversible. The tragedy showed how dangerous it can be when empathy disappears. When people stop seeing another person as someone with feelings. When a human being becomes only a target. That is perhaps one of the most disturbing parts of the case. Not only the violence itself, but the way a person's humanity was ignored in that moment. Rena was not just a name in an investigation. She was someone's daughter, someone's family member, someone who had hopes and fears, someone who was still discovering who she wanted to become. The world never got to see the adult Rena might have become. It never got to know the dreams she might have followed, the friendships she might have created, the challenges she might have overcome. Her story ended before it was supposed to, and that is why her memory continues to matter. The legacy of Rena Verk is not only about crime. Every day, people make choices about how they treat others. They choose whether to include or exclude, whether to speak or stay silent, whether to show kindness or cruelty. Those choices may seem small, but they shape the world around us. The case also became a reminder that young people need support. Teenagers are often expected to handle difficult situations while they are still learning how to understand themselves. They face pressure from friends, pressure from society, pressure to fit into groups. But behind every teenager is a person who needs guidance, understanding, and care. The responsibility of adults is not only to punish after something goes wrong. It is also to create environments where young people can ask for help, where they can admit they are struggling, where they can feel valued. Rena's story continues to be discussed in schools and communities because the questions it raises remain important. How do we recognize someone who feels alone? How do we stop cruelty before it becomes violence? How do we encourage people to act when they see something wrong? These questions do not belong only to one case. They belong to every community, because every community has moments where someone needs support. The story of Rena Verk also reminds people that justice is important, but justice alone cannot heal every wound. A conviction can acknowledge responsibility. A sentence can recognize the seriousness of crime. But healing requires something more. It requires remembering the person who was lost. It requires learning from what happened. It requires trying to create a future where similar tragedies become less likely. For Rena's family, her memory continues beyond the courtroom. She remains the girl they loved, the daughter they raised, the person whose absence changed their lives forever. For society, she became a symbol, a reminder that every young person deserves respect. Every young person deserves safety. Every young person deserves the chance to grow. The tragedy of Rena Verk cannot be rewritten. The past cannot be changed. But the future can still be influenced by the lessons left behind. A person who chooses kindness can make someone feel seen. A person who speaks up can prevent harm. A person who cares can change the direction of another person's life. The most powerful way to remember Rena is not only to remember how she died, it is to remember that she lived. She had a personality. She had emotions. She had dreams. She had value. Her life was more than one terrible night. And perhaps that is the final lesson of her story. Behind every tragedy is a human being. Behind every headline is a life. Behind every case is a reminder that people matter. Rena Verk was 14 years old when the world lost her, but her story continues to speak. It asks people to notice, to listen, to care, and to remember that sometimes the smallest act of compassion can become the difference between someone feeling completely alone and someone knowing they are not forgotten. Her life was short, but the message left behind continues. A person's worth is never determined by how others treat them. Every life has meaning, and every person deserves to be seen. Part 16, The Enduring Echo, Why Rena Verk's Story Still Matters. Time has a way of changing how people remember events. The immediate shock of a tragedy slowly becomes history. The faces that once appeared in newspapers become older memories. The conversations that once filled communities become quieter. But some stories remain because they touch something deeper than the crime itself. The story of Rena Verk is one of those stories. It remains because it is not only about one night. It is about the moments that lead to that night. It is about the people who were involved. It is about the choices that were made. And it is about the responsibility that everyone carries when they see another person struggling. When people look back at the case today, they often focus on the same painful question: how could something like this happen? How could a group of teenagers become involved in an act of such devastating violence? The answer is not simple. There is no single explanation that can capture everything. Human behavior is complicated. People are influenced by their surroundings, by their relationships, by their fears, by their desire to be accepted. But understanding those influences does not erase accountability. It does not change the fact that Rena lost her life. It does not change the pain experienced by her family. It does not change the permanent consequences created by that night. Instead, understanding helps society recognize the warning signs that can appear before tragedy happens. The case of Rena Verk showed that violence can sometimes grow in places where people least expect it, among classmates, among friends, among young people who are still learning how to navigate the world. That reality made the case especially painful, because childhood and adolescence are supposed to represent growth, learning, discovery, a time when people begin imagining their future. Rena never received that future. Her life stopped before she had the chance to become the person she might have been. That loss is impossible to measure. No legal decision can calculate the value of a life. No sentence can replace the years that were taken away. This is why remembering victims matters. Because when a person becomes known only through a tragedy, something important can be lost. The world can forget that they were once simply human. Rena had moments before the tragedy. She had experiences. She had feelings. She had people who cared about her. She had a story that existed long before the night that changed everything. The continued discussion of her case has also highlighted the importance of emotional awareness among young people. Teenagers often experience intense emotions. Friendships can feel extremely important. Acceptance can feel like everything. A person who feels rejected may carry pain that others never notice. A person who feels excluded may search desperately for somewhere to belong. This does not mean every struggle leads to something tragic, but it reminds society that small signs should not always be ignored. A person who seems quiet may be suffering. A person who seems angry may be hiding pain. A person who seems disconnected may simply need someone to reach out. The legacy of Rena's story is partly about learning to see people more clearly, not judging too quickly, not dismissing problems because they appear small, not assuming someone else will help, because communities are created through everyday choices. The way people speak to each other, the way they treat someone who is different, the way they respond when something feels wrong. These moments shape the environment around us. The case also changed how many people viewed the role of witnesses. A person does not have to commit an act of violence to influence the outcome of a situation. Sometimes the most important decision is whether someone chooses to act, whether someone says something, whether someone refuses to participate, whether someone stands beside a person who has been isolated. The idea of being a bystander became one of the strongest lessons connected to Rena's story. Silence may seem passive, but silence can still have consequences. The absence of action can sometimes allow harm to continue. At the same time, one act of courage can interrupt that pattern. One person can make another person feel seen. One person can remind someone that they are not alone. Years after the case, Rena's name continues to appear in discussions about kindness, bullying prevention, and youth responsibility. Not because people want to remember only the tragedy, but because they want to understand what can be learned from it. Her story became a reminder that prevention begins long before a crisis. It begins with relationships, with communication, with empathy, with paying attention. The world cannot change what happened to Rena, but the world can choose what happens after remembering her. It can choose whether her story becomes only a painful memory, or whether it becomes a reason to create something better. The most meaningful way to honor someone who has been lost is not only to remember the circumstances of their death, it is to remember their humanity. Rena Verk was more than the victim of a crime. She was a young girl who deserved more time, more experiences, more opportunities, more life, and although her story began with tragedy, the lessons connected to her memory continue. They remind people that every person deserves respect. Every person deserves compassion. Every person deserves a chance to feel that they belong. Because sometimes the difference between someone feeling invisible and someone feeling value begins with a single person choosing to care. Part 17, The Unanswered Questions, looking deeper into the tragedy. Even after the legal battles ended, the case of Rena Verk continued to raise difficult questions. Some cases are remembered because of their shocking details. Others remain because they force society to look at itself. Rena's story belongs to the second category. It became a painful reflection of how young people interact, how communities respond to suffering, and how easily someone can become isolated while others fail to notice. The tragedy was not only about what happened beside the water that night. It was also about everything that came before. The relationships, the conflicts, the feelings of rejection, the moments when someone might have stepped in, the moments when someone might have asked a different question. A different choice at a different time could have created a different outcome. But history does not allow people to return to those moments. It only allows them to learn from them. One of the reasons Rena's case continues to be discussed is because it challenges the way people think about violence. Many people imagine violence as something that appears suddenly, a moment of anger, a single decision, a clear beginning. But in many real situations, violence develops through a series of smaller events. A person becomes comfortable with cruelty. A group begins accepting harmful behavior. Someone who is being targeted becomes increasingly isolated. The line between acceptable and unacceptable behavior becomes unclear. This gradual process is what makes prevention so important, because the warning signs often appear before the final moment. The case of Rena Verk also highlighted the complicated world of teenage relationships. During adolescence, belonging can feel incredibly powerful. Friendships can influence identity. Social groups can determine how people see themselves. For some teenagers, being accepted by others becomes a priority above everything else. This can create situations where people follow a group even when they know something is wrong. The desire to fit in can become stronger than personal judgment. But the lesson from Rena's story is that belonging should never come from hurting another person. True friendship should not require cruelty. Acceptance should not depend on humiliation. A person should never have to become smaller so that someone else feels bigger. The case also made people reflect on the idea of responsibility. Responsibility is not only about the person who commits the final action. It also involves the choices made before and after. Who encouraged? Who ignored? Who knew? Who stayed silent? These questions are difficult because they involve human behavior. People are not always prepared to face situations that feel dangerous or uncomfortable. Fear can control decisions. People may worry about consequences. They may believe they cannot make a difference. But the story of Rena Verk showed that every person has some influence over the environment around them. A community is shaped by what people accept. If cruelty becomes normal, cruelty can grow. If kindness becomes normal, kindness can grow. The difference often begins with individual choices. Another lasting impact of the case was a conversation about how society remembers victims. A victim is often introduced through the tragedy that ended their life. But that is only one part of their story. Rena was not born as a symbol. She did not live her life knowing she would become part of a national discussion. She was simply a teenager. She had her own personality. She had her own experiences. She had her own hopes. Remembering that matters because it brings humanity back into the story. It reminds people that behind every case file is a real person. The years after Rena's death also showed how difficult healing can be after a tragedy. Healing does not mean forgetting. It does not mean pretending that the pain never existed. It means finding a way to carry the memory while continuing forward. For families, this process can last a lifetime. They continue celebrating birthdays that never happened. They continue remembering conversations that will never happen again. They continue imagining the future that was taken away. The public may eventually move on to other stories. But families never stop remembering. That is why the way society talks about victims matters. A person should not only be remembered for the worst moment of their life, they should be remembered for the fact that they lived. They existed. They mattered. Rena's story continues because it speaks to universal human experiences: the need to belong, the fear of being rejected, the importance of being seen. Everyone understands, in some way, what it means to want acceptance. That is what makes the tragedy so powerful. It reminds people that behind every person is a hidden story. Someone may appear confident while struggling internally. Someone may appear surrounded by friends while feeling completely alone. Someone may need help without knowing how to ask for it. The memory of Rena Verk continues to challenge people to look closer, to pay attention, to question harmful behavior, to understand that compassion is not weakness. It is a responsibility. Her story cannot be changed. The past cannot be rewritten, but the lessons remain. And those lessons continue to ask the same important questions. Are we paying attention? Are we listening? Are we willing to act when someone needs help? Because sometimes the most important moments are not the ones that appear in history books. Sometimes they're the quiet moments when one person decides to care about another. Part 18, The Lasting Legacy, a reminder for future generations. Years have passed since the death of Rena Verk, yet the emotions surrounding her story have never completely disappeared. For some people, the case represents one of the darkest moments in Canadian history involving youth violence. For others, it represents a turning point, a moment when society was forced to look more closely at problems that had often been ignored: bullying, isolation, peer pressure, the need to belong, the silence of people who witnessed suffering. These issues existed before Rena's death, and they continue to exist today. That is why her story remains important, because the tragedy was not only about the events of one evening. It was about understanding the human behavior that surrounded those events. It was about recognizing that serious harm can sometimes begin with smaller moments that people choose not to notice. A cruel joke, a person being pushed away from a group, someone being treated as if their feelings do not matter. At first, these moments may seem harmless, but repeated over time, they can create an environment where someone feels completely alone. Rena's story became a reminder that words and actions have power. People often underestimate the effect they have on others. A comment that seems small to one person may become something deeply painful for another. A decision to exclude someone may feel temporary to those making the choice, but can leave lasting emotional damage. This is why the memory of Rena continues to influence discussions about kindness and responsibility, because preventing tragedy does not begin only with laws or punishments. It begins with how people treat each other every day. The case also changed the way many people think about the role of communities. A community is not simply a collection of individuals living in the same place. It is a network of relationships. Every person affects the environment around them. When people choose empathy, they create safety. When people ignore cruelty, they allow harmful behavior to continue. The lesson is not that every person can prevent every tragedy. The world is more complicated than that. But every person can influence the moments around them. Every person can decide whether to add kindness or harm, whether to include or exclude, whether to speak or remain silent. The story of Rena Verk also continues to raise questions about young people and the challenges they face. Teenagers are often navigating difficult emotions while trying to understand themselves. They are learning about identity, friendship, confidence, their place in the world. During this period, acceptance from others can feel extremely important. A person may change how they act because they want approval. They may hide their struggles because they fear judgment. They may avoid asking for help because they believe nobody understands. This is why support systems matter. Young people need spaces where they feel safe expressing themselves. They need adults and friends who are willing to listen. They need reminders that their value does not depend on popularity or social acceptance. Rena's life continues to be remembered because it represents more than tragedy. It represents the importance of seeing people before they disappear into the background. It represents the importance of noticing when someone is struggling. It represents the importance of treating others with dignity. The case also showed that justice and healing are different things. Justice looks at what happened. It examines evidence. It determines responsibility. Healing looks at what remains afterward. It is about families learning to live with loss. It is about communities learning from painful experiences. It is about making sure that something meaningful comes from something heartbreaking. For Rena's family, no amount of public discussion could replace the daughter they lost. No lesson could remove their pain. But remembering Rena's life has allowed her story to become more than a tragedy. It has allowed her memory to become part of a larger conversation about protecting young people. The most important thing to remember is that Rena was not a case before she became a case. She was a person. She had a childhood. She had dreams. She had relationships. She had a future that should have continued. The tragedy of her death should never erase the reality of her life. As time continues to move forward, new generations learn about Rena's story. Some learn about it through history, some through discussions about bullying, some through conversations about compassion. But the message remains the same. People matter. Their feelings matter. Their experiences matter. A person who feels ignored today may become someone who remembers kindness tomorrow. A person who feels alone today may be helped by one person choosing to reach out. The legacy of Rena Verk is not only a reminder of what went wrong, it is also a reminder of what could be done differently, to listen sooner, to care more, to notice the people who are struggling quietly, because behind every person is a story that others may not see. And sometimes the choice to recognize that story can change everything. Rena's life ended far too early, but the lessons connected to her memory continue. They remain in classrooms, in communities, in conversations, and in the choices people make every day. Her story reminds the world that compassion is not a simple gesture. It is a responsibility. And every act of kindness is a way of ensuring that no one feels completely invisible. Part 19, Remembering Rena, the person behind the headlines. When history remembers a tragedy, there is always a risk that the person at the center of it becomes lost. The details become stronger than the individual. The investigation becomes more familiar than the life that existed before it. The questions become louder than the voice of the person who was taken away. But with Rena Verk, remembering her means looking beyond the tragedy. It means seeing the girl who existed before the world knew her name. It means remembering that she was not defined by one night. She was defined by 14 years of life, 14 years of experiences, 14 years of moments shared with family and people who knew her. The story of Rena is often told through the events surrounding her death, but every victim has a story that begins long before the tragedy. And Rena's story began with a young girl trying to find her place in the world. Like many teenagers, she was searching for identity. She was trying to understand herself. She wanted friendships. She wanted acceptance. She wanted to feel that she belonged somewhere. Those feelings are universal. Almost everyone at some point in life understands what it means to want to be accepted. That is why her story continues to affect so many people. Because beneath the details of the case is something deeply human. The desire to belong, the fear of being rejected, the hope that others will see and understand you. Rena's struggle was not unique. Many teenagers experience moments of loneliness or insecurity, but her story became a reminder that these feelings should never be ignored. A person who feels isolated may not always show the world what they are experiencing. Someone can smile while carrying pain. Someone can appear surrounded by people while feeling completely alone. This is why compassion matters. Because sometimes the people who need support the most are the ones who have the hardest time asking for it. The years after Rena's death showed how much impact one life can have. Although her time was short, her story encouraged important conversations. It encouraged people to think about the way they treat others. It encouraged communities to examine how they respond when someone is being excluded. It encouraged parents and educators to pay closer attention to the emotional lives of young people. These changes cannot undo what happened. Nothing can, but they show that even after tragedy, something meaningful can emerge. A painful story can become a reason for people to act differently. The memory of Rena also reminds people that victims should never become just symbols. Symbols are important because they represent ideas. But people are more than ideas. People have personalities. They have habits. They have dreams. They have moments that only the people close to them know. Rena was not born as a symbol of a social issue. She was simply a teenager, a person with her own thoughts, a person with her own experiences, a person whose life had value. Remembering her in this way changes the focus. Instead of only asking how she died, people also ask who she was. What did she enjoy? What made her laugh? What moments made her happy? What dreams did she have? These questions matter because they return something important to victims, their humanity. The case of Rena Verk also remains a reminder that the choices people make toward others can have lasting effects. People often underestimate small actions, a kind word, an invitation, a moment of understanding. These things may appear simple, but for someone who feels alone, they can mean everything. At the same time, harmful actions can also leave lasting wounds. Cruel words, public humiliation, deliberate exclusion. These experiences can shape how a person sees themselves. The lesson from Rena's story is that people should never forget the power they have over one another. Every interaction creates an impact. Every choice sends a message. Every person has the ability to either add to someone's pain or help reduce it. More than 2 decades later, the case still carries emotional weight because it represents a question that many people continue to ask. What could have been different? Could someone have noticed sooner? Could someone have reached out? Could someone have chosen another path? Those questions may remain unanswered, but they continue to encourage reflection. They encourage people to be more aware, more compassionate, more willing to act. Because the greatest lesson from Rena's story is not only about the tragedy that happened, it is about the responsibility people have before tragedy happens. The responsibility to notice, the responsibility to care, the responsibility to remember that every person around us is carrying a story we may not know. Rena Verk's life was cut short, but her memory continues, not because of the violence that ended her life, but because her story reminds people of the importance of kindness. She remains a reminder that behind every name is a person, behind every person is a life, and behind every life is a story worth knowing. Rena deserved more time, more experiences, more opportunities, more memories, but although her future was taken away, the meaning of her life continues through the lessons her story has left behind. A reminder that everyone deserves to be seen. Everyone deserves to be heard. Everyone deserves to feel that they belong.